I've always believed in respecting people's choices, identities, and personal journeys. But there's a line between empathy and denial of reality, and for me, that line is drawn at biological sex. No matter how much society evolves, how progressive our ideologies become, or how advanced medical technology gets, one truth remains unshakable: biological sex is immutable. It's not an opinion, it's not a social construct, and it's certainly not up for debate. It's science, plain and simple. When a child is born, a doctor doesn't assign a sex arbitrarily. They observe the baby's physical anatomy, male or female, and make a determination based on observable biological characteristics. This isn't a random act of labeling, it's rooted in thousands of years of human biology. Our chromosomes, our reproductive organs, and our hormonal structure define our biological sex. These are not features we simply opt into or change like fashion choices. They are coded into every cell in our bodies. Even people who transition genders, who take hormones or undergo surgery, remain biologically the sex they were born with at a chromosomal level. X is female, XY is male. That doesn't change. What's troubling is how increasingly difficult it's become to even say this out loud without being labeled a bigot or transphobe. The idea that stating biological facts could be considered offensive shows just how far down the rabbit hole we've gone. We've reached a point where feelings are elevated above facts, and any attempt to bring the conversation back to objective truth is met with outrage. I understand that gender dysphoria is real and that those suffering from it deserve compassion and support. But compassion shouldn't mean we lie. Supporting someone doesn't require denying biology. I'm not denying that people feel genuinely out of sync with their gender identity. I don't doubt for a second that gender transition is a deeply emotional, personal, and often painful journey. But feeling like you're the opposite sex doesn't make you biologically the opposite sex. That's where the difference lies. You can change your name, your clothes, your voice, and even parts of your body, but your DNA, the very blueprint of your physical existence, remains untouched. It's not just about chromosomes either. Biological sex manifests in so many ways: muscle mass, bone density, cardiovascular function, and even brain structure. These biological differences explain, for instance, why men and women perform differently in sports. It's not sexism, it's biology. That's why the issue of transgender athletes competing in women's sports has stirred such controversy. When a biological male, regardless of their gender identity, competes against biological females, they often have an undeniable physical advantage. That doesn't make the person evil or undeserving of respect, but it does make the competition unfair. And pretending otherwise is dishonest. I've noticed a growing reluctance to even acknowledge the reality of sex. In classrooms, in newsrooms, in political discourse, language is being altered to fit a new ideology. Terms like pregnant person or chest feeding are replacing biological terms like mother and breastfeeding, all in an attempt to be inclusive. But what ends up happening is that women, the very people these terms originally described, are being erased. It's a strange and ironic twist. In trying to include everyone, we end up diminishing the uniqueness of what it means to be male or female. The heart of the issue for me is not about rejecting people's identities or experiences. It's about refusing to reject reality. Biology doesn't lie. It doesn't bend to social trends or political pressure. And while our understanding of identity may evolve, and should, we can't do so by tearing down the foundation of science. When biology is seen as offensive, we're heading into dangerous territory. We risk raising a generation that's confused not just about identity, but about the most basic truths of the human body. And let's not forget the long-term implications. When children are taught that sex is fluid and changeable, we place them on a path filled with confusion, encouraging minors to undergo irreversible treatments, puberty blockers, hormone therapy, surgeries. Based on feelings that may pass is not progressive, it's reckless. We must allow children to explore who they are, yes, but not at the cost of denying their biology or pushing them toward life-altering medical procedures before they can fully understand the consequences. At the end of the day, I want people to live as freely and happily as possible. I want them to feel safe, accepted, and loved. But I also believe truth matters. And the truth is, biological sex cannot be changed. We can adapt, identify differently, even medically transition to align our bodies with how we feel inside, but we are still fundamentally bound by the biology we were born with. That doesn't invalidate anyone's journey or make them less worthy of respect. But it does mean we need to anchor our conversations in facts, not feelings. Respect doesn't require denial. Compassion doesn't demand distortion. And progress should never mean abandoning truth. Growing up, I never really questioned the idea that boys were boys and girls were girls. It was something so basic, so universally accepted, that it seemed almost silly to think too deeply about it. But as I've gotten older and watched society evolve, I've come to understand that gender isn't as rigid or binary as I once believed. The more I've listened, read, and reflected, the more I've come to see that gender identity is not strictly a biological condition. It's a social and personal construct. It's shaped by culture, upbringing, environment, and personal experience, rather than hardwired into our DNA like biological sex. Biological sex is based on physical traits, chromosomes, hormones, reproductive systems. But gender, that's something else entirely. It's how we perceive ourselves and how we express that perception to the world. From the moment we're born, we're wrapped in blue or pink, given toys that match our assigned sex, and treated according to the expectations tied to our genitals. Society teaches us what it means to be a man or a woman, what roles we're supposed to play, how we're supposed to behave, and even what emotions we're allowed to feel. And we carry those lessons into adulthood, often without even realizing how deeply conditioned we are. What's striking is how different cultures interpret gender. In some societies, there are more than just two recognized genders. Indigenous cultures, like the Native American concept of two, spirit people, have long acknowledged that identity can go beyond male or female. In other parts of the world, like in South Asia, hydras have existed for centuries as a recognized third gender. These examples show that gender is fluid across time and geography. It is a cultural narrative that changes, not a universal biological reality. When I hear someone say, "I feel like I was born in the wrong body," I don't hear confusion. I hear someone who's trying to reconcile their internal truth with the roles society has tried to impose on them. For someone to say, "I identify as a woman," even if they were born male, is not necessarily a denial of biology. It's a declaration of how they understand themselves in a social and emotional context. That distinction is important. It doesn't mean we must discard science or facts. It means we must make room for personal truth within the social landscape we've created. People often confuse gender identity with sexual orientation, but they're not the same thing. Gender identity is about who you are. Sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to. A transgender person may be straight, gay, bisexual, or anything else. The confusion comes from our need to categorize everything, to box people into definitions that make sense to us. But identity doesn't always fit into neat labels. Sometimes it defies categorization entirely, and that should be okay. What I find powerful about gender identity being a construct is that it allows people to take ownership of their self-expression. It gives them permission to break free from outdated expectations and discover a more authentic version of themselves. And yes, for some, that means changing their pronouns, their appearance, or even their names. For others, it might simply mean rejecting stereotypes and embracing a broader, more fluid understanding of masculinity or femininity. Either way, it's an act of self-determination, not delusion. Critics argue that this leads to chaos, that we're allowing people to make up who they are. But isn't that what we've always done in some form? Haven't artists, thinkers, and rebels throughout history constantly redefined what it means to be human? Why should gender be the exception? If anything, the freedom to explore and express gender identity has made people more honest, not less. I'd rather live in a world where people are encouraged to be real than one where they're forced to lie just to fit in. Of course, there are challenges. Language is evolving quickly. New pronouns, new terms, and new ways of understanding gender are emerging all the time. It can be hard to keep up, but I don't believe the answer is to reject all of it out of frustration or fear. The answer is to listen, learn, and adapt, just as society has always done. We didn't always believe the earth was round or that women deserved the vote. We've changed our minds before. We've grown before. This is no different. At its core, gender identity being a social and personal construct doesn't mean it's not real. On the contrary, it's very real in the lives of those who experience it. Just because something isn't rooted in chromosomes doesn't make it any less valid. Love, grief, identity, none of these are tangible, things you can see under a microscope, but they shape our lives in profound ways. Gender identity is no different. It's a deeply personal journey shaped by context, experience, and emotion. I may not fully understand what it feels like to be gender non-conforming or to transition, but I don't have to. I just need to recognize that people have the right to define who they are, especially when society's definitions don't match their truth. We're all trying to find meaning in a complex world. If allowing people the freedom to identify in the way that makes the most sense to them brings them peace, comfort, or confidence, then who am I, or anyone, to take that away? In the end, gender identity is not a threat to society. It's a mirror reflecting back the complexity of human experience. It challenges us to move beyond the black and white, to see people as they see themselves, and to acknowledge that truth can live in the space between biology and belief. Every time I witness a heated debate in today's world, especially those revolving around identity, climate, medicine, or biology, I can't help but notice how often science is placed in direct conflict with ideology. It's as though facts and beliefs are locked in a permanent war with no room for compromise or understanding. This conflict isn't just academic, it's bleeding into policy, education, media, and everyday conversation. And it's deeply troubling because once we start sacrificing evidence for emotional comfort or political correctness, we begin to lose our grip on reality. Science, at its core, is a method. It's a way of questioning, testing, observing, and validating knowledge. It evolves, yes, but it's rooted in a commitment to truth based on measurable, repeatable results. Ideology, on the other hand, is rooted in belief systems, often driven by values, culture, or politics. There's nothing inherently wrong with having strong beliefs, but the problem starts when those beliefs demand obedience at the cost of evidence. We've reached a moment where people are more likely to believe what fits their narrative than what data actually shows. Take the topic of gender and biology. Science tells us that biological sex is determined by chromosomes, XX for females, Y for males, and this difference carries through nearly every cell in the human body. Yet in ideological circles, particularly in progressive discourse, this fact is now seen as controversial. The assertion that sex is binary and grounded in biology is often labeled transphobic, even when it's not accompanied by any hatred or malice. But denying a biological reality doesn't make someone more compassionate. It makes them dishonest. It's possible to support trans people's rights and dignity without rejecting the fundamental truths of human anatomy. This same tension shows up in debates over climate change. The overwhelming scientific consensus is that human activity is contributing to global warming. The data is there. The models are clear. Yet entire ideological movements dismiss or downplay this reality because it conflicts with their economic or political interests. Rather than addressing the problem with innovation or reform, they attack the science itself, branding it as alarmist or part of some liberal agenda. When ideology stands in the way of scientific consensus, society suffers because policy based on denial never leads to good outcomes. It's not just one side of the political spectrum that's guilty. Both the left and the right have weaponized ideology against science whenever it suits them. In the pandemic era, I saw people reject medical guidance based on their political identity. Masks became symbols of oppression or virtue. Vaccines were painted as either miraculous or malevolent, depending on who you asked. And scientists were alternately hailed as saviors or smeared as conspirators. The facts didn't change, but how people interpreted those facts did, all based on the ideological filter they viewed them through. One of the dangers of ideology is that it discourages nuance. Science thrives on nuance. It embraces uncertainty, allows for revision, and seeks better answers. Ideology, by contrast, demands certainty. It frames the world in terms of good and evil, oppressor and oppressed, believer and heretic. When that mindset seeps into scientific discourse, it distorts everything. Suddenly, questioning becomes dangerous. Dissenting opinions, even if based in data, are silenced. People begin to fear speaking honestly because they don't want to be labeled or cancelled. I've watched brilliant scientists get dismissed not because their findings were false, but because their conclusions challenge the dominant ideological narratives of the time. That's not progress, that's censorship. And it's ironic because the very movements that once championed free thought, open inquiry, and challenging authority are now enforcing intellectual conformity in the name of inclusion or justice. But truth doesn't bend to social pressure. It doesn't care about political correctness. It simply exists, waiting to be discovered, whether or not it fits someone's agenda. Education is perhaps where this conflict is most visible and most dangerous. Schools and universities are supposed to be places where young minds are exposed to diverse ideas, where they learn how to think critically, challenge assumptions, and follow the evidence. But many institutions now prioritize ideological alignment over intellectual rigor. Students are taught what to think instead of how to think. Certain topics are off limits. Certain questions can't be asked. And in doing so, we're not just stifling discussion, We're producing a generation that confuses ideology for truth. This isn't about rejecting all beliefs. Everyone has values and worldviews, but values should guide how we treat others, not how we define objective facts. If we truly care about justice, progress, and human flourishing, then we need to build those goals on a foundation of truth. And that means allowing science to speak, even when its answers are uncomfortable. It means creating space for open debate, not silencing those who disagree. It means acknowledging that truth and compassion are not enemies. They can and must coexist. The line between science and ideology will always be tested because humans are emotional creatures. We want our beliefs to be validated. We want the world to make sense in a way that fits our moral framework. But if we allow ideology to overrule evidence, we lose the very tools that help us understand the world. The challenge isn't to destroy ideology, but to keep it in its rightful place and let science do what it was always meant to do, uncover the truth, no matter how inconvenient it may be. There's a growing tension in today's world that seems almost impossible to resolve, a clash between the principle of freedom of expression and the desire to protect what is considered the truth. On one side is the belief that people should be free to speak their minds without fear of censorship, punishment, or public shaming. On the other side is the concern that allowing the spread of false, harmful, or misleading ideas under the banner of free speech can cause real damage to society. Balancing these two values is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and it's not as simple as choosing one over the other. Freedom of expression has always been seen as a cornerstone of a functioning democratic society. It's what allows people to question authority, challenge the status quo, and express themselves fully, even when their ideas are unpopular. Without it, progress would be nearly impossible. Most of the advances we now take for granted, civil rights, gender equality, scientific discoveries, emerged from voices that were once considered disruptive or even dangerous. The moment we start silencing those voices, we risk freezing society in place and allowing only a narrow, approved perspective to exist. But the world is not as black and white as it once was. The internet, social media, and digital platforms have transformed the way information spreads. Now, anyone with a smartphone can reach millions of people in seconds. That power has opened doors for marginalized voices, but it has also become a breeding ground for misinformation, conspiracy theories, and intentional deception. When falsehoods spread faster than facts and lies become more attractive than the truth, the very fabric of society begins to weaken. That's where the argument for protecting truth enters the picture. In an age where science denial, election fraud claims, and dangerous medical advice can spread unchecked, many believe it's necessary to intervene. The goal, they argue, is not to suppress free speech, but to prevent harm. Just as society has rules to stop people from yelling fire in a crowded theater, it makes sense to have boundaries around speech that can mislead people on matters of public health, security, or human rights. But here's where it gets complicated. Who decides what the truth is? That question is what makes this debate so delicate. Truth is not always a fixed object. It can evolve. Scientific understanding changes. Cultural norms shift. Historical interpretations are revised with new evidence. What's considered truth in one era might be challenged in the next. If a central authority, whether governmental or corporate, gets to define what is true and suppress anything that deviates from it, we run the risk of falling into authoritarianism. The tools we create to fight misinformation can just as easily be used to silence legitimate dissent. There's also the danger of double standards. Too often, efforts to protect the truth end up targeting only one side of the ideological spectrum while allowing the other to spread unchecked. When tech platforms or media institutions become arbiters of truth, their own biases, intentional or not, begin to influence who gets to speak and who doesn't. That creates resentment, deepens divisions, and fuels the very extremism these efforts claim to prevent. People begin to feel like their voices are being erased, and that drives them further into echo chambers where radical ideas fester without challenge. A healthy society doesn't just tolerate disagreement, it thrives on it. Truth is not protected by silencing lies. It's protected by exposing lies to scrutiny, debate, and evidence. When false ideas are brought into the open, they can be challenged, debunked, and rejected. But when they're suppressed, they often grow stronger in the shadows, fueled by the belief that someone is trying to hide the real truth. Censorship, no matter how well-intentioned, can easily backfire. That doesn't mean there should be no limits at all. Speech that incites violence, promotes terrorism, or clearly puts lives at risk does cross a line. but those boundaries must be drawn narrowly and with care. The danger is when we start policing speech not based on harm, but on discomfort, when opinions are silenced simply because they're offensive, controversial, or challenge popular narratives. That approach creates a climate of fear where people self-censor not because they're wrong, but because they're afraid of the consequences of being misunderstood. It's important to remember that freedom of expression is not just for ideas we like or agree with. It's for everyone. And the only way to protect that freedom is to defend it even when it feels inconvenient. The truth doesn't need to be sheltered. It needs to be tested. The moment we start believing that the truth is so fragile that it must be protected from debate, we've already lost sight of what truth really is. The challenge then is to cultivate a culture where truth is pursued relentlessly, but never at the expense of open dialogue. We need better education, critical thinking, and a shared commitment to facts, not more censorship. We must trust that when people are given access to all ideas, they will ultimately choose the truth. It won't always be easy, and the road will be messy, but freedom of expression and the protection of truth are not enemies. They are partners in the fight for a more honest, just, and free world.